Honourable Senators, I rise today at second reading to speak to Bill C-45, an act to legalize and regulate cannabis. C-45 is one of those once-in-a-lifetime bills. Despite the attempts of ministers and others to convince me to think otherwise, I feel too many unanswered questions and unintended consequences will result in the passing of this bill. The purpose of this bill, according to Clause 7, is to protect public health and public safety. The bill also lists 7 specific objectives. 3 of those objectives are: number 1, to restrict youth access to cannabis; 2, reduce the burden on the criminal justice system; and 3, deter and reduce criminal activity. I am not convinced Bill C-45 is the answer to these objectives. I would even say, as many experts argued, that C-45 contradicts the basis of these objectives. While I recognize the Trudeau government feels its agenda to legalizing marijuana is progressive, I have serious concerns with the number of aspects of this bill. The literature on this subject matter is extensive. We have to get this right. We owe it to our kids and our future generations. With my limited time, I want to focus on 2 issues that I need to be thoroughly reviewed. Drug impairment in the workplace and youth access to marijuana. Workplace. I come from northeastern British Columbia. Oil and gas, agriculture, forestry, and heavy industries are the driving force of our local economy. These are highly specialized fields with heavy equipment operators working in sometimes hazardous environments. We all know that employers are required by law to ensure a safe work environment. Most have codes of conduct or workplace safety and health policies that forbid workers from being drug impaired. But the best code of conduct is not always foolproof. Last year, the Canadian Human Resources Profession Association published a report called Clearing the Haze: The Impacts of Marijuana in the Workplace. The association conducted an exclusive members-only survey to identify employers' concerns. The top 5 concerns were: employees operating motor vehicles, number 1. Number 2, disciplinary measures. Number 3, decreased work performance. Number 4, employees using heavy machinery. And 5, attendance. Workplace safety was the top concern, as the report states. Marijuana is already the most commonly encountered substance in the workplace drug testing, but its use is expected to grow exponentially after full legalization. Which begs the question, what tools are available to employers to ensure their employees are not impaired on the job? Doctors of BC recognize that unlike measurements of blood alcohol, there is currently insufficient scientific evidence to link a particular blood THC level with impairment. As they point out, tests on oral fluid testing devices are still being conducted to ensure their reliability and accuracy, and while such devices may be coming, they do not exist now. That is an issue. We all know that companies in many industries, including the oil and gas sector, conduct non-random drug and alcohol testing. We also know that many work sites are dry. In other words, no alcohol or drugs are allowed on site. But what about random testing? What would be accepted? Consider this recent court decision. Suncor is a major oil company. Last year, it decided that it wanted to conduct random tests to bolster workplace safety. Unifor argued that random tests would be a violation of the rights and privacy of its 3,000 or so members. In December 2017 decision, a judge ruled with the union. Disappointed with the court's injunction, Suncor said, preventing Suncor from taking steps to address known safety hazards associated with workplace alcohol and drug use is not reasonable. The union, for its part, felt that the ruling gives weight to a person's dignity on the job and that human rights are being upheld. I find it concerning that someone would disagree with allowing an employer to randomly test someone. Many work in high-risk environments where a person's motor control, balance, or reaction time, all of which can be affected by the consumption of marijuana, could be a matter of life and death. The BC Trucking Association also weighed in on the issue. It agrees on a regulatory framework to allow employers of workers in safety-sensitive occupations to conduct random workplace drug and alcohol testing. As the Canadian Trucking Alliance argues, trucking companies will be faced with two new dangers with this bill. First, how to ensure truck drivers are not under the influence. And second, the likelihood of increased danger to their own drivers through the presence of more motorists operating while impaired. The Alliance believes that until there is clear evidence and a complete understanding of what level of impairment is deemed to be considered safe, a zero-tolerance policy regarding the presence of marijuana in a truck driver's system is the only safe choice. Yet, in the absence of roadside tests to measure impairment and/or if impairment cannot be measured on the job, it will be impossible for employers to enforce a zero-tolerance policy. In a brief table before the Task Force on Marijuana Legalization and Regulation, the association, representing 500,000 federally regulated employees from the transportation and communication sectors, recommended that government pass legislation allowing employers in the federal sector to conduct random drug and alcohol testing for safety-sensitive positions. I'm no legal scholar, but C-45 could create a legislative vacuum with regard to random testing and leave a place to more litigation and uncertainty in the law. I raise these questions because I am worried of the unintended consequences of legalizing marijuana on safety at work. I don't want to address drug-impaired driving today, but there are many similarities with impairment in the workplace. All I will say is that the results of the March 2016 survey of 3,000 Canadians show that all of those who drive high, 44% of them think they can drive safely. Now on to youth and cannabis. The second issue I want to address is youth. I think it's fair to say that this issue is likely top of mind for most of us. C-45 is based on the principle that marijuana should be far from the hands of kids. Unfortunately, this bill is contradicting that principle. The Canadian Pediatric Society argues that cannabis legislation will have a significant impact on the lives and health of children and youth, and safeguards are necessary. Based on the physical and mental health risks, and with many legal, financial, and public safety issues at stake, policymakers must continue to limit access to cannabis. I agree with the Canadian Pediatric Society. We must limit youth access to marijuana. This bill does not achieve that goal. Doctors of BC have stated that evidence suggests that if the younger person starts using cannabis, the greater the risks for a variety of adverse health and social outcomes, which may include injury, substance abuse, and mental health or education problems. Further, statistics show that 1 in 6 people who started using cannabis as a teenager become addicted to it. We also know that frequent and continued use in early adolescence has been associated with increased risks of harms. Brain development can be affected until the age 25, and perhaps even beyond that, as noted by some members in the Senate. Having said that, I have concerns with Clause 8 of the bill, which basically allows young persons to possess and distribute 5 grams or less of dried cannabis or its equivalent. In this context, youth would not face criminal prosecution or be subject to criminal record. Anything above 5 grams would be subject to the Youth Criminal Justice Act. For context, 1 joint typically contains 0.33 to 1 gram of dried marijuana. So kids could have anywhere between 5 and 15 joints on them at any time. I find it remarkable when the Minister of Health and Justice write that they have, and I quote, been encouraging provinces and territories to establish offenses to permit, or prohibit, I should say, young people from possessing any amount of cannabis. According to the Minister of Justice, all those who have introduced cannabis legislation have established such prohibitions. The government claims it wants to keep marijuana out of the hands of youth. If that's the case, why hasn't it prohibited entirely and not allow the 5-gram provision? Many of us are grandparents. Is it reasonable for our grandkids to carry 5 grams of dried cannabis? My oldest grandson is 9. In a few years, he could pack around 5 grams. I find it amazing that we would have a bill that says we want to keep it out of the hands of young people, but yet at 12 years old could pack around 5 grams of it. Think about the peer pressure on those kids in school. One saying to the other, I got 5 grams in my pocket, how much you got in yours? Heck, kids can hardly go to school now without the right pair of jeans on, let alone having a few joints in their pocket. I don't want my grandkids to have to face that. In no way, shape, or form do I want that to happen. While I appreciate not criminalizing youth for possession of small amounts of marijuana, and I agree with that, one needs to question where this youth would have access to cannabis in the first place. Under the current law and even under C-45, youth cannot buy marijuana legally. The Justice Minister told us that youth should not have any amount of cannabis, quote, and yet her bill allows for it. Talk about a contradiction. How can that be? Further, she adds that there will be no legal means for a young person to obtain recreational marijuana or cannabis, and that's another quote. The black market will continue to serve our youth. In fact, I'm worried it'll cater specifically to them in some ways. As Senator White said, the legalization of marijuana will have no impact on black market illegal trafficking among youth purchasers. Any suggestion here by the Minister or the Prime Minister or this government is untrue, and I totally agree with that statement. Further, the government argues this bill seeks to eliminate illegal cannabis-related activities. Minister Goodale feels Canadians will adapt to purchasing behaviors and switch to legal pot shops. Unbelievable. I think that's a little naive. Some may not. Last time I checked, there is still an illicit tobacco market out there generating millions of illegal dollars. I also feel a private home cultivation of 4 plants will make marijuana that much more readily accessible to youth. As the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police submit, the personal cultivation provisions are counter to the bill's stated objective of protecting the youth, and that's what I talked about earlier. I want to go back to one of the underlying objectives of this bill is to keep marijuana away from our youth. Like the chiefs of police, I'm actually worried that this bill will lead to increased exposure and consumption. This could also lead to addiction. Some have even talked about marijuana as a gateway drug. Many questions remain unanswered. Marijuana is a gateway drug, as far as I'm concerned. I can stand here today at 73 years of age and say I've never touched illegal drugs. None. Except alcohol. It's not illegal, it's legal. And so, I could tell you that what happens, at least with alcohol, and I think it's similar to drugs. I didn't start drinking whiskey. I started drinking beer. The lighter stuff, the gateway. Cheap wine. At that time, wine was cheap in British Columbia. That's a long time ago. And you could drink as much as you want. It went on to drinking the hard stuff. And I can say that 35 years I've been clear. I'm an alcoholic. I don't drink alcohol in any way, shape, or form, and haven't touched it for just under 35 years. So I believe that marijuana is much the same as alcohol. And it's something that will get our kids started on it. I don't drive around Vancouver as much as I used to, but when I do and I go to downtown East Side and I see what's happened there with people's lives, it is sad, terribly sad. And I don't think those people just started on heroin or the hard drugs, whatever they call them. I think many of them started on marijuana and continued on to the hard drugs. And we see what takes place.
Your time is up.
Could I ask for just another 5 minutes?
Are we agreeable, 5 more minutes?
Thank you. I won't take a full 5. I just have a few things left to say. But that part worries me an awful lot. It worries me about the youth. It worries me about my grandkids that will be subject to this, that they can carry it around, 12 grams. I find it terrible. So again, I go back to one of the underlying objectives of this bill, is to keep marijuana away from our youth. Like the chiefs of police, I'm actually worried that this bill will lead to increased exposure and consumption. This would also lead to addiction. Some have even talked about marijuana as a gateway drug, as I said. Many questions remain unanswered. Before I conclude, allow me to share, or pardon me, in conclusion, while I highlighted a few issues that I'm concerned about, I think it goes without saying that many other issues need to be addressed. I think, for example, of the unreliable and unscientific drug recognition tests, law enforcement training, revenue sharing with municipalities, sale and accessibility of edibles, and the list goes on. I'm confident that the committees that have been tasked with studying Bill C-45 will do a thorough review. I hope they will take into consideration all of the points of contention that have been raised by senators during second reading debate. In my view, this bill is inconsistent with government's intended goals, which is why I will not support it. Thank you, Senators.
Senator Lincoln, do you have a question?
Yes.
Senator Neufeld, would you take a question?
Yes.
Senator Neufeld? Yes.
Issues and questions that all of us have in this chamber about Bill C-45. We're all concerned about the health of young people. We're all concerned about workplace health and safety. I would say that one of the things I'm pleased about right now is that we're having open discussions about these issues as a result of the introduction of this bill. They're all issues that predated the introduction of the bill. And I think it's good for kids and good for public health in Canada that we're having this discussion now. I want to ask about two things. One, the so-called 5-gram allowance for kids between 12 and 17. You've mentioned this, and I'm glad that you did. Bill C-45 was clear that such an allowance was available, and it left to provinces and territories the ability to vary that if it wished. I wonder if you are aware that the large majority, in fact all provinces and territories that have landed on implementation plans and enabling legislation have removed any access to a 5-gram allowance, that they have landed on nobody under the age of 18 or 19 should have legal access to cannabis or a free pass. So the 5-gram allowance across province and territories is essentially being eliminated. I would raise one other question with you. I wonder if you're aware on the age 18 and 19 limit, where the government, the federal government again gave to set a minimum age of 18 and gave to provinces and territories the ability to set a higher limit if they wished. That all those provinces that currently have plans, and that's the large majority of provinces, have landed on 18 or 19. And I wonder if you're also aware that on the question of age 18 and 19, that the Canadian Public Health Association, the Canadian Pediatric Society, the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse, the Canadian Centre for Addictions and Mental Health, the Canadian Association of Pediatric Health Centres, Pediatric Chairs of Canada, the Canadian Mental Health Association, registered nurses, the Institut National de Santé Publique have
Senator Dean, it's lovely to have you back, but could you get to the
landed
point?
on age 19.
The time is, where is the question?
That is the question. I wanted to know if the senator was aware that 5 grams is being eliminated across the country by provinces and
Senators,
territories.
we're out of time.
Okay, thanks.
I'm very sorry. Senator Neufeld's time is up. Senator Unger on debate. Oh, sorry, Senator Neufeld, are you requesting more time? I could just give a quick answer. Are we in agreeable, honourable senators?
Well, in answer to your questions about the youth, and that's the one I'll stay on. The purpose of the bill: A, protect the health of young persons by restricting their access to cannabis. Why did the federal government have to leave it to the provinces to do that when they wrote in the bill that kids could actually access that, or carry it, I should say, when they're 12 years old? Why didn't they actually live up to what they wanted to do? But why does the provinces have to do it? This is a federal bill and federal legislation, and the federal government should have had the sense to do it in the first place, instead of saying to the provinces, now it's in your court, you do whatever. Thank goodness. Thank goodness the provinces got the good sense and the brains to say we're going to do something about this crazy thing. Thank goodness that they did, because it seemed to be that the federal government couldn't figure that out. Okay? Thank you.
Senator Unger on debate.
Fellow Senators, the Liberal government's plan to legalize marijuana will make Canada the first developed country in the world to do so. This fact alone should give us pause. So what is it with this plant, this weed, that makes it the pariah in all other democratic countries, and the reason Canada should not, absolutely not, be contemplating legalization? Why is it that these Canadian institutions that were mentioned, the Canadian Medical Association, Psychiatric Association, Pediatric Society, and the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, have all been voicing their concerns about the negative impacts of cannabis? Question: to whom is this Trudeau government listening and or taking advice from? Let's consider some facts. The main psychoactive chemical that today's users seek, and the chemical that is responsible for most of the intoxicating effects, is commonly known as THC, or delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Upon consumption of marijuana, THC enters the lungs and is quickly absorbed into the bloodstream, then gets carried to the brain, where it begins to interfere with normal brain activity. The chemical structure of THC is remarkably similar to a naturally occurring brain chemical called anandamide, which functions as a neurotransmitter in the brain, sending chemical messages between nerve cells and throughout the nervous system. This similarity allows THC to mimic the role of anandamide, which then allows THC to alter normal brain communications and to be recognized by the body. But THC is much stronger than anandamide and can have profoundly negative effects, such as impaired thinking, interference with the ability to learn and perform complicated tasks, and also disrupting function of brain areas that regulate balance, coordination, and reaction time, to name but a few. Simply put, if someone attempts to rewire the electrical system of your car by altering a system that is complex, delicate, and carefully designed, you would be alarmed and probably outraged, because you would know that your car will never again run properly. This scenario is the developing brain on marijuana. Effects of THC are felt almost immediately, with feelings of euphoria and relaxation, but the pleasant feelings are by no means universal. Others may experience feelings of anxiety, panic, paranoia, or fear, potentially caused by unexpected THC concentrations, excessive consumption, or the user is inexperienced. An acute psychosis with delusions and hallucinations are possible with large THC doses, but these temporary reactions are distinct from the permanent brain damages, most importantly, to the brain from persistent marijuana usage. Study after study has demonstrated that THC impairs the wiring of a young person's brain in an irreversible manner. Regular marijuana use by children and by youth, those under the age of 25, permanently alters their brain size, structure, function, and brain fiber connectivity is diminished. Regular usage by children and youth under the age of 25 has been linked to poor school performance, increased school dropout rates, a significant decrease in IQ that does not recover with cessation, increased risk for psychotic disorders, a decrease in initiative later in life, resulting in diminished lifetime achievements, and the gateway effect of marijuana has been well documented. But in addition to being stronger than anandamide, THC remains in the body's fatty tissues for much longer. This is because THC is fat soluble. After being rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream, THC can attach to and be stored in fatty deposits in the body, impacting brain functioning for potentially untold periods of time. But the harm doesn't end there. THC, which has been sequestered in body fat, can be released back into the bloodstream of the user, possibly by exercise, fasting, or trauma. Upon re-entry into the bloodstream, the THC again travels to the brain and can produce a second high, which, although less intensive, has the same negative impacts. The implications of this are numerous. A couple of examples. Researchers tell us it is possible that THC concentrations re-released into the blood could reach sufficient levels to cause cannabinoid-related cognitive defects. For example, having smoked a joint a week ago, that should be deficits. For example, having smoked a joint a week ago, a near-miss car accident could release THC back into the person's bloodstream, causing possible impairment. Heavy marijuana users have been known to give positive urine samples after 77 days of drug abstinence. This introduces significant complications when doing drug testing for employment or impairment. But marijuana doesn't just harm children and young adults. Marijuana exposure during pregnancy results in lower birth weights, an increased risk of behavioral problems, and neurocognitive challenges regarding short-term memory. Anandamide is responsible for the development of the fetal brain, and marijuana consumption, even in low concentrations during pregnancy, interferes with this process. Additionally, the Journal of Toxicology reported in 2009 that due to the intake of cannabis by mothers, infant children, depending on breastfeeding, might exhibit physiological effects such as sedation, reduced muscle tone, or other adverse effects. Furthermore, while marijuana reportedly helps minimize nausea, heavy use can lead to episodes of violent retching and abdominal pain, a condition known as cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS. At one time, this condition was considered to be quite rare. But in a study published last month in the journal Basic and Clinical Pharmacology and Toxicology, found that amongst frequent marijuana users, over 1/3 presented CHS symptoms. Colleagues, time doesn't allow me to attempt to detail more of the many negative health impacts which are caused by marijuana usage, but these impacts are real and they are many. The question is, what can be done? The primary way to reduce the harm caused by marijuana or any illegal drug is to reduce usage. Legalization will do the opposite. Rather than reducing consumption, legalization will cause it to increase. Legalization creates normalization of a dangerous, life-altering drug which reduces the perception of risk. Researchers have observed for decades that when anti-drug attitudes soften, there is a corresponding increase in drug use in the coming years. And that is from the United States Department of Justice Drug Enforcement Agency. The DEA goes on to say, an adolescent's perception of risks associated with substance abuse is an important determinant of whether he or she engages in substance abuse. Youths who perceive high risk of harm are less likely to use drugs than youths who perceive low risk of harm. The historical records clearly illustrates this fact. If you look at historical usage of marijuana by youth, you will find that over the last 50 years, the rate of use has followed a nearly identical trend line in both the US and in Canada. In the early 1970s, usage began to increase rapidly until 1978, when it peaked at about 35% in Canada and 37% in the US. But then usage began to drop steadily and rapidly for the next 13 years, until it reached a low of almost 12% in 1992. This downward trend stopped in 1993 when youth usage began to rise again quite quickly, and by 2015 settled in at roughly 22% in the US and 24% in Canada. That's according to Statistics Canada. Question is, why did it change? The American Society of Addiction Medicine studied this in 2012 and found that over the last 40 years, youth usage has moved in concert with the perceived risk of harm. When perception of harm goes down, usage goes up. When perception of harm goes up, usage goes down. When plotted on a graph, the lines move in almost perfect symmetry. And you will see these graphs, they're being emailed to everyone. So what caused the plunge in usage through the 80s and early 90s? Researchers have noted that the decline coincided with the rise of the parents' movement in the United States. This movement has been credited with changing public attitudes toward marijuana, resulting in a change of government policy under President Reagan. Concerned parents worked hard to educate their kids and the government about the harms of pot usage. Marijuana became denormalized and the perception of risk increased. What became known as the parents' movement lasted from 1978 to roughly 1992. This time frame coincides with the largest drop in youth usage of marijuana in history, as youth were provided information about the harms and risks of usage. To this date, the U.S. federal government has not legalized marijuana, and in the states which have legalized, the minimum age for use is 21. So changes are needed. Canada of late has become very concerned about concussions, with many strict protocols being implemented by sports organizations around the globe. dealing with this serious issue. But most concussions heal with time without life being altered. Yet in this place, we senators appear to be ready to appease the Trudeau government and agree with legalizing this noxious weed, which is known to cause permanent, irreversible damage to our most vulnerable groups, our children and our young adults. Why would we say yes when the horrible, irreversible consequences are proven by MRI and brain scans and by autopsy? Senator Galvez, in her recent speech, has had many questions for the government. Each senator in this place should have many questions. And senators, I remind you that we are in this place representing 30 million Canadians. We should, each one of us, have 50 questions for this government, and we should demand answers from this government. And we, the select few with sober second thought, should not consider saying yes to this odious legislation until we, on behalf of all Canadians, have all the answers. I believe that at a minimum, an intensive 4-year educational blitz beginning now should begin now before any government contemplates legislation. As our American neighbors have shown, when people of all ages have all the facts, they just say no. Thank you.
Senator Unger, there's Senator Pratt, who I think would like to ask a question, and you're out of time.
Could I have enough time to answer a question?
Honourable colleagues, are you in agreement? 5 more minutes? Senator Pratt.
Take a question, yes?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, you mentioned, Senator, in your interesting speech, the fact that the number of users or percentage of users has varied over time. But there is one factor that you did not mention, is the fact that this evolution has been totally indifferent to the prohibition regime, and the fact that, for instance, when you look at the number of arrests in Canada over the years, whether the number of arrests have increased or decreased over the years, the percentage of users has been totally indifferent to that. And this is why, after all, we're here. We're here to replace an inefficient prohibition regime with something else. So would you agree that at least the prohibition regime has not been working to reduce use, and that we have to look at something different?
Senator Unger?
Senator Pratt, I didn't speak about convictions or sentencing, but I do know that legalization means normalization, and kids who may never have considered using marijuana, now that it's legal, well, they're going to go and try it because the government said it's okay. It's now legal. So I think that what is needed, as was the case in the United States, we need education, not after this legislation passes, before this legislation passes. And beyond that, I have no further comment.
Sénatrice Moncion.
Senator Moncion. Madam Speaker, honorable senators, my comments today will deal with Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. This bill concerns an extremely sensitive and complex issue which will change the social and cultural portrait of our country. Talking about legalizing and decriminalizing marijuana is one thing, but discussing its effects and the way to help our youth aged 10 to 17 is another. In my opinion, this aspect is not adequately addressed in the study of this bill and is at the heart of our concerns. This bill offers no solution to the early consumption of marijuana and the likely development of mental health problems that can result from it.
Believe that marijuana education, prevention, and awareness programs are inadequate and that the investments that are being considered in this area are insufficient. The same is true for investment in research into the harmful effects of marijuana and the implementation of addiction programs. According to an article on the BBC website under the heading Health, adolescence would now extend from the age of 10 to 24 years old. This period of life dedicated to exploration and adventure is the stage where the individual tries to define himself as a future adult, where he believes himself invisible and invincible and safe from danger. The desire to experience all that life has to offer is exhilarating. Young people want to explore sex, drugs, cigarettes, thrill-seeking experiences. It is the very nature of the individual going through an exhilarating period of his life. For these reasons, and as we have seen, the elimination of cannabis use among young people is wishful thinking. Mon propos en deuxième lecture vient apporter.
My comments at second reading will be complementary to those of my colleagues who have already spoken about the aspects that concern them in Bill C-45. This contribution, I hope, will allow the members of the committee studying the issue to better understand the aspects for which we're seeking reassurances that nothing will be neglected in the study of this important bill.
Surrounding the regulatory framework for C-45, specifically with respect to the multiple license categories that will be awarded, the licensing process, and the security clearance. I will briefly discuss the financial aspect of this bill, including the Canadian market for production, the selling price per ounce, the supply and demand management. Finally, I will provide comments on edible cannabis and non-regulated cultivation of marijuana plant. Le projet de loi C-45.
Bill C-45 proposes attributing 11 types of licenses or permits: 4 for cultivation, 2 for processing, 3 for testing, research, importation, and exportation, and finally 2 for product sales for medical and recreational purposes. The awarding of licenses and permits targets 3 precise objectives. 1, to allow the establishment of a legal industry that is diversified and competitive, composed of large and small retailers in all regions of the country. 2, to reduce the risk of organized crime infiltrating the legal products market. And 3, giving assurances that legal cannabis products will meet the high-quality standards. Attribution, the follow-up, and management of these licenses or permits, and the verification of criminal records will be the responsibility of the Canadian Department of Health, except for those concerning the retail sale of medical and recreational products, which will fall under provincial and territorial jurisdiction. Given the complexity of the operations associated with the issuing of licenses and permits and possible infractions, it will be necessary to set up a working framework with the collaboration of the RCMP, the Department of Justice, and police leagues across the country.
Forces. It is proposed that the ministry may refuse a security clearance to all persons associated with organized crime or who have had previous convictions for drug trafficking with young people, for corruption, money laundering, fraud, or violent offenses. It is also proposed that the name of the directors and officers, not only of the organizations applying for the license or permit, but also of their parent company, be provided. The names of the shareholders holding more than 25% of the shares must be provided to prevent the real owners from evading the transparency requirements. À prime abord, la logistique sous-tendant la
First of all, the logistics surrounding recreational cannabis cultivation, production, and sales will be onerous. The insignificant number of licenses and permits and the regulations surrounding the entire operations of this new industry will be even more complex concerning the process for awarding licenses, following up crops, and controlling the production of the supply chain. The government will have to be particularly vigilant. Furthermore, the establishment of regulations for the cannabis industry will require follow-up and frequent inspections of the production chain, the transformation cycle, and points of sale. The producers will be required to conduct systematic quality tests, to follow best production practices, and to publish reports concerning their volume of production.
System along the supply chain to ensure the quality and conformity of products to established standards, compliance with the rules on the sale of consumer products, and to prevent derivation of legally produced cannabis to the illicit market. The costs associated with the implementation of this new infrastructure will be high and will require the hiring of highly skilled and competent workforce to meet the monitoring and control requirements. Without questioning the government's skill in this area, there are still unknowns about the management and implementation of this new industry. Le marché du cannabis.
The cannabis market represents an excellent business opportunity for Canada. Although we may not be in agreement with the legalization of cannabis, the fact remains that the economic spin-offs associated with this industry will be significant, and we will see more and more countries legalizing marijuana. Currently, Canada is the largest producer of medical marijuana in the world, and the largest concentration of producers is in Ontario.
Of cannabis for medical purposes has 8 facilities located in Ontario, Quebec, and Saskatchewan. The company's executives are working to establish an additional 2.4 million square feet in Canada for the production of cannabis for recreational purposes. The economic benefits associated with this market and the generation of jobs will be important for the provinces of Newfoundland and Labrador, New Brunswick, and British Columbia. In addition, this company has already entered into business partnerships with other countries, including Jamaica, Chile, Brazil, Germany, Spain, Denmark, and Australia, which gives additional access to raw materials and strains of different cannabis plants. Ce qui m'amène à discuter du prix.
This brings me to the issue of sales price and the management of cannabis supply and demand. One of the government's stated objectives concerning Bill C-45 is to reduce or even eliminate the illegal cannabis market. Taking this into account, it is therefore essential to study the issue of price setting.
Has issued a report on the subject and recommends that the median price of 1 gram of cannabis be around $7.50 before applicable taxes. The report focuses on the unit price, 1 gram of cannabis, and not that of larger purchases. The study commissioned by the federal government, Price of Weed, also refers to a price per gram of between $7.14 and $7.69. This price depends on the quality of the product. If the government wants to tackle the illicit cannabis market, it will have to take into account the current purchasing habits of regular users who buy much more by volume than by unit. The 3 most popular quantities bought on the illegal market are the 7 grams that sell for around $50. 1 ounce, which contains 28 grams, sells between $120 and $190, and a quarter of a pound, which contains 4 times 28 grams, sells for around $400. The cost of a gram sold varies between $3.57 and $7.14, depending on the quantity purchased. This leads me to question the unit price set by the government. How can $10 a gram help the government compete with the illegal market? Selon les recommandations du groupe de travail sur la légalisation et la...
According to the recommendations of the working group on the legalization and regulation of cannabis, a limit of 30 grams would be permitted for personal possession of dried cannabis in public, what cost will it be for that 30 grams? $300? Even if we say that legal products are better controlled and of better quality, the prices of the legal market are high, which means that the gains of the legal market may be less significant than anticipated.
Contained in cannabis will also be an important factor in comparing the two markets. The legal market offers THC concentrates up to around 30%, whereas Bill C-45 refers to a concentrate of less than 10%. According to the recommendation of the Working Group on the Legalization and Regulation of Cannabis, the concentrate should not exceed 15%. This component needs to be studied carefully. On the one hand, a 10% concentrate of cannabis better protects the health and safety of the population. On the other hand, the percentage is too low to attract regular users. Finalement, comment sera gérée l'offre du marché licite?
Finally, how will the supply of the legal market be managed? What will happen if the production of legal cannabis is too high for the market's demand? Will the price go down? Will the government ask producers to destroy their excess production? Will surplus production be taken by the government to be sent to organizations that do research on cannabis? On the contrary, if there isn't enough supply for demand, where will we find production? What will happen to the price? Now let's talk about edible products with cannabis that will only be available 12 months after the implementation of Bill C-45. This 12-month period will be essential for the government to be able to adequately prepare and raise awareness about the particularities of edible products.
Variety of foods, including cooking oils and beverages, ointments, extracts, creams, and concentrates. With the legalization of cannabis, we will find it in thousands of new products. The Colorado experience tells us that these products are very popular. However, their effects are less understood than those of smoked cannabis, and it is more difficult to control the amount of THC consumed, which represents a danger in terms of overconsumption. While the effect of cannabis is felt on average 9 minutes after being smoked, the effect of an edible product takes longer to appear. The consumer will need to be informed and given instruction as to the maximum quantities that can be taken at one time. L'expérience du Colorado nous fait voir le danger que représentent les...
The experience of Colorado demonstrates the danger of edible cannabis for children in terms of accidental ingestion. Incidents involving children under 8 years of age more than doubled after the legalization of edibles. The 12 months between the legalization of cannabis and that of edibles must be used to raise awareness among consumers regarding the dangers of these products.
Legalization and regulation of cannabis recommends prohibiting any product that is deemed attractive to children, including products that look like or mimic familiar foods, that have a candy-like packaging, or that are brightly colored or attractive to children. In addition, the same working group recommends that the packaging be opaque, reclosable, and childproof. These edible products could even be placed in sealed, difficult-to-open containers, as is currently the case for some pharmaceutical and highly toxic products or poisons. Quant aux emballages, ils devront préciser les informations relatives à leur confection.
Regarding packaging, they must contain information on how they are made, the maximum quantity of THC and CBD per portion, contain a warning label for children and the dangers associated with their use. The last part of my presentation regards security regarding the individual production of cannabis plants. What we know is that the Act will allow for 4 plants to be grown in a residence. Reasonable security measures to prevent theft and access to young people must be taken. Small-scale cultivation of cannabis at home is not without risk, especially in terms of the safety of children. The current version of the bill has no restrictions regarding locked spaces for cultivation within the home, secure zones for production outside, and visibility of plants from the street or homes nearby. Do you desire another 5 minutes? Yes, please.
Thank you. Donc, malgré le fait qu'il n'est pas prévu que ce type
Despite the fact that it may not be a very popular way of obtaining cannabis, there should nevertheless be adequate regulations to protect vulnerable people.
I would like to speak on the need to legalize cannabis. Since the late 1960s, thousands of Canadians have used cannabis and are doing so freely. They maintain the organized crime market at over $4 billion a year. Despite that, we can be against the legalization of cannabis for recreational purposes, the fact remains that products are accessible on the illicit market and that consumers have easy access to them. By legalizing recreational cannabis, we allow the creation of a regulated industry that meets high-quality standards and over which we have some control, and I say some control. We provide Canadians with standardized product that meets specific inspection standards. In addition, we inform them of the harmful effects of cannabis use on physical and mental health, and we allow them to make an informed decision. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you for your attention.
Senator Tkachuk on debate.
Colleagues, as we have seen time and time again, whether it is with the Minister of Finance's tax reform proposals, the Minister of Defence's peacekeeping efforts, and now with this cannabis legislation, the government has not paid much attention to the details. As Kelly McFarland, writing in the National Post, put it, this government is proving itself to be long on messes. The electoral reform mess, the botched inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women, the shambles of a policy on procuring new fighter planes. A government that can't organize a Prime Minister's trip to India cannot be trusted with developing the infrastructure for the legalization and sale of marijuana. The government, as usual, doesn't seem to have given much thought to the implication of what they are proposing. It's more interested in the superficialities of the message. Tax the rich, Canada is back, than they are in getting the policy right. That stands to reason. If you are just not ready, your policy isn't going to be ready either. If there is any piece of legislation deserving of thoughtful analysis and sober second thought, it is Bill C-45. If the goal is to legalize marijuana, then thoughtful consideration must be given to all gaps which currently exist with a serious effort to address them. Canadians have lived under the current legal regime for many decades, so what is the emergency? I'm confident that we can manage to wait longer to ensure that the public safety is protected. Tamara L. Macaron, a PhD candidate in health science at the University of Calgary, and Fiona Clement, an assistant prof at the same university, wrote recently, "We suggest that marijuana legislation in Canada might be a 10-year project. They figure that some issues can wait, but that, and I am quoting them here, there are some key issues that urgently need to be decided before legalization, such as online sale and occupational health and safety." These two individuals are scientists, they're experts. They are the people that this government, with its supposed focus on evidence-based policy making, promised to listen to. And they are not alone, these two. I have received dozens of emails, as many of you also have, from individuals expressing legitimate concern about the fast-tracking of legalization. I'm not sure that the rest of you have as well. I'm sure that the rest of you have as well. Here is an excerpt from one. If there ever has been a piece of legislation that clearly called for that cool second thought, I suggest that it is the bill to legalize possession and distribution of marijuana. Among the many medical experts warning us that it is harmful not only in the short term but also permanently, are Health Canada and the Canadian Medical Association. Please act to prevent our young people from growing up with reduced mental capacities due to the use of marijuana. As well, other areas which have legalized this drug have found that it leads to higher vehicle accident rates. Not only the users, but every driver on our roads is put at increased risk as people with impaired judgment cruise our highways. Please protect us from the danger. Legalization of marijuana use starts us on a nightmare road of death and loss. Here's another one from a gentleman who outlined some of the issues he has, citing and providing links to reputable sources for his information as well. He summed it up like this: I'm not necessarily against decriminalization or legalization once there are adequate studies to clarify the health risk, but it seems reckless for the government to forge ahead without this crucial information. What's the harm of delaying legislation by a year or so to give time for adequate research? It seems to me that at this stage, it is only the Senate that has the power to slow down the process and demand time for proper research to be done to answer the concerns of Canadian citizens. I'm asking you as a member of the Canadian Senate to take the perhaps unpopular and difficult step of helping the Senate fulfill its mandate of providing sober second thought regarding Bill C-45. These emails aren't the only ones we usually get. We're part of an orchestrated campaign of form letters sent out by some interest groups. These are from individual Canadians who are worried, not necessarily because they don't want to see cannabis legalized, because, like me, they feel that the government hasn't adequately prepared and considered the implications of legalization. A study on the legalization in Colorado found that youth past month marijuana use from age 12 to 17 increased 20% in a 2-year average since Colorado legalized recreational marijuana compared to the 2-year average prior to legalization. Nationally, youth past month marijuana use declined 4% during the same time frame. What better place than in the Senate, which can exert its highly advertised and self-promoted power of sober second thought? Isn't that what the Trudeau appointees keep telling us that this place is for? What better time than now with this bill? For a lot of Canadians, one of the most worrying areas is that of workplace safety, and for me, transportation safety. There are those who tell us there's nothing to worry about. For instance, last month when Maclean's published an article calling on the need for more research on the effects of marijuana in the workplace, a pundit we're all familiar with tweeted, "Can we stop with these? You can't drink in the workplace and it's legal. Why should smoking be any different?" Well, perhaps he'd forgotten about the Sunwing Airlines pilot arrested 1 year earlier at the controls of another airline. He'd been drinking. How did they find out? Not because of a random testing regime that does not exist in Canada, but because he passed out in the cockpit prior to takeoff. He had blood alcohol level of more than 3 times the legal limit for driving a car, not to mention an airline full of passengers. This is not an anomaly. According to the FAA figures, 1 pilot a month failed alcohol and drug tests over a 5-year period. 64 in total failed the test between 2010 and 2015. For people like us, many of whom get on a plane twice a week when the Senate is sitting, this should be, how should I put it, sobering. Now we are adding another substance to the list. Now that marijuana hasn't been as widely available as alcohol before, but now we are making it legal, the government is involved. And the onus is on the government to do everything it can in the area of workplace and transportation safety. Here's a quote from the Maclean's article that I mentioned earlier. What is striking is how little high-quality evidence there is on the impact of marijuana in the workplace, and how inconsistent the existing data is. We urgently need high-quality observational research study to be able to better understand the effects of marijuana on work. We also need to develop an accurate measure of impairment for use in the Canadian workplace. It's very easy to sit back and say, there's nothing to worry about. You don't drink in the workplace, and it's legal. Why should smoking be any difference? It wasn't more than a week after these words were tweeted out that the 2 Toronto police officers had to call for backup after eating marijuana edibles on duty. At least they didn't smoke up. Health Canada survey found that nearly half of those surveyed felt that marijuana use affects driving. Nearly 20% were convinced cannabis use does not affect driving. A CEA survey found that 1% of those surveyed believed that someone under the influence of marijuana is actually better behind the wheel than someone who is sober. Police in Canada are legitimately worried that impaired driving will go up when marijuana becomes legalized, and the evidence in Washington and Colorado bears that out. Experts in the field of addiction medicine agree. I can tell you that if people think they can drive a car high, they will think they can drive a train high, or that they can drive a plane high. Having met with a number of people in the industries where workplace safety is an issue, I can tell you they are all very concerned. They urged us to make sure that before the government passes this legislation, it first passes legislation mandating alcohol and drug testing in federally regulated safety-sensitive positions. That may delay the passage of the bill, and so be it. I can live with that. What I can't live with, and I don't think anybody here can, is to be in the position of having voted for this bill and seeing these regulations coming in only after it becomes law, not in response to the bill, but in response to a tragedy. Thank you.
Senator Forêt.
Senator Forêt. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Dear colleagues, I wish to share with you my main concerns regarding C-45, which will have a major impact on our society. There have already been many speeches here about the legalization of cannabis, and some of the points that have been raised are of particular interest to me. First, I would like to thank Senators Joyal and Pratt, who have done excellent work in highlighting the very concerning issues related to the capitalization of cannabis companies. Keeping this issue in the public eye is paramount. It would be inconsistent as parliamentarians to call for the legalization under the pretext of getting organized crime out of the illicit distribution of cannabis, to then give them the opportunity to get in through the back door by funding licit legal production companies. I would wholeheartedly support amendments to the bill in this regard. Colleagues, I am in favor of legalizing cannabis for a very simple reason. Any amount that we get out of the hands of the black market by offering a legal alternative with certified and controlled products is a gain for our society, given the current consumption in Canada. I support the government's goals of getting organized crime out of the production and distribution of cannabis. I also agree that the public policy of the criminalization and prohibition of cannabis has not worked, not at all. I'm also in favor of the agenda set out that has been negotiated in the past few days with the different leaderships that would have an implementation of the Act happening after July 1st, 2018 for two reasons. First, it seems clear on the ground that the July 1st date was causing a lot of anxiety and concern. If we are going to make such a radical change, we should do so properly. And here I echo the Public Health Minister of Quebec, Ms. Lucie Charlebois, who said she agreed with extending the implementation of the bill. Second, it is our mission to make this bill better, and will take the time necessary to do so. I'm confident that that's what we will do. My speech will have two focuses today. First, I'd like to talk about a point I regularly hear during different speeches on Bill C-45. Then, given that I'm not on the Social Affairs Committee, which it seems will be studying the bill, I would like to provide a few points as food for thought for debate during the study of this bill. Our colleague, my seatmate, Senator Galvez, said the following in the Senate: Bill C-45 is a complete repeal of prohibition and an absence of regulation. It transfers the majority of the responsibilities of legalization to the provinces, which in turn are transferring them to municipalities. However, consideration should be given to keeping more controls at the federal level. Regarding the criminal code, of course, we must respect the primacy of the federal government. But today, we have a division of powers of jurisdiction based on a constitution that dates back to the 19th century. The principle sets out that the federal government has responsibility for any power and jurisdiction that hasn't been designated otherwise, and that bothers me. The European Union has been built since 1957 with the principle of subsidiarity that provides the most effective level of government with the means of providing services, delivering service, or regulating in that area. With that in mind, and keeping in mind that legalizing cannabis will be done in the backyard of municipalities, Ottawa must ensure that communities have the legislative, technical, and financial means to fully take on these heavy responsibilities. Thought must be given to this with the provinces, the territories, and the municipal sphere.
It's very different. I will take as an example the great speech given by my colleague Senator Patterson, where he voiced the concerns of the mayors of his territory about the bill. Chacun des maires avait des préoccupations différentes.
Each one of the mayors had different concerns. Federal one-size-fits-all solutions to local problems don't seem an effective way of preparing and developing public policies. We are writing a page in history with the legalization of cannabis. Not only must we prepare a regulatory framework and a law that meets these goals, but why wouldn't we take this opportunity to adopt a different model for implementation? Let's give local communities the power to adapt the regulation to their situations. I think a step in the right direction has been made with the decision of the finance minister to give 75% of excise tax revenue to the provinces. It would be relatively easy to copy the model of the excise tax on gas for cannabis. Stable, predictable funding that goes directly to communities who are delivering services.
Federal level of government is rarely doing work on the ground. There are former mayors here, former police chiefs. You know what I mean. It is sur le terrain that we will see the consequences of the decision we are taking in this chamber.
I would like this avenue to be considered when it comes time to implement the regulatory framework. The federal government certainly has the funding, but not necessarily the solution to every evil. Second, I would simply like to provide some food for thought for the Social Affairs Committee for its study of the bill. These are concerns that I have and that are regularly expressed to me, and I think they deserve to be studied seriously. First, Norway seems to have one of the lowest rates of cannabis use in the world, even though the government of Norway only decriminalized cannabis use very recently in December 2017. Inviting representatives from the government of Norway could be helpful so they can talk to us about their experience to share best practices with us. Furthermore, I'm very concerned about the psychological phenomenon of trivializing the substance, especially because the act allowed youth to have less than 5 grams, which seems to be restricted at the provincial level. The clear examples of alcohol and cigarettes among young people should lead us to be very cautious and to ensure that the prevention and awareness plan for young people is robust with the necessary funding to reach its goals. Furthermore, legalizing the use of cannabis may be interpreted as trivialization of its use, which could lead to an increase. So let's be doubly cautious. The goal is not to encourage consumption. The bill must provide clear directives to provinces regarding the distribution and marketing of cannabis. In this regard, marketing and promoting cannabis to encourage sales must be prohibited, in my opinion. In addition, we must ensure that the rates of THC are clearly indicated on all products that are sold so that consumers can make an informed decision. Here, federal jurisdiction must be consistent throughout the country.